I feel like a lot of kids who grow up with more than one language, whether it be two, whether it be five, I'm always envious of people that can speak several languages. But, I know that it is really hard to find a balance. So it's not just the culture, that you're trying to find your own unique mix of it, but the language is always a huge part of it. And I know a lot of TCKs like me who some of them don't really know very much Japanese or they don't use it. And so I completely understand. And it's a very personal thing, I think. When I tell people, like just randomly, I meet people or I'm introduced to people or whatever, I meet people and, we start talking about our various, our own stories, and they're like, "Oh, Japan, you grew up there, so you must be fluent in Japanese." And I kind of chuckle because I'm like, just because you grow up in a culture does not make you fluent in the language. It's so interesting how people just assume, I'm like, "No, you don't understand." Um, and to this day, when I talk to Japanese or talk to people and say, "Yeah, I grew up in Japan," it's like, "Oh, okay, yeah. So that's why you speak Japanese." And they kind of write it off like it's not a big thing. And I'm thinking to myself, you don't understand all the drama and all the frustration that I've gone through to get to this point. And for me, at one point when I was in Japan working, doing radio, of course I had to start learning how to read scripts and teleprompters. And, like even with voice work, I had to start to learn to read Japanese with that too. And every time I go in, I kind of go back to that fifth grade me where I'm so intimidated by the situation. I'm like, "Oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh." And I'm so hard on myself when it comes to that kind of thing, But at one point though, I did try to learn Japanese. I took private lessons, and I think it was twice a week I was going to to study Japanese. And when I first met with my teacher, I remember her telling me that she said, "Liesl, you are the hardest student to teach. And I'll tell you why. You already have a good sense." By then I was, I could speak Japanese and it was pretty good. She said, "But you have a relatively good handle on the language as far as speaking, but you have such a gap between the spoken Japanese and the writing and the reading. And so for you, it's going to be extremely frustrating because you are going to have to learn and relearn stuff that you already know that you're like, why do I need to do this? Right. Plus I was working. So she said, it's going to feel like a lot of the stuff that you're learning doesn't really apply to your everyday, job. And so because of this, it's going to be really hard on you." And she was right. I did go to Japanese or lessons for a year and a half, but finally I just said to myself, I can't do this anymore. It was just too frustrating. And I didn't really have that much time to study. And so, I just said, okay, yeah, this is not for me. But I continue to be a student of the language because I continue to have these jobs where I have an enormous learning curve and they're very uncomfortable. I just had one recently where I had to do a translation and it was for 70 files from Japanese to English. And I don't do very much translation. Now, for those of you that don't know, interpreting translation, completely different skill set. Interpreting is more about being live and in the moment, and you have to do the back and forth, back and forth, back and forth between the two languages. But for me, honestly, and it's going to sound weird, but it reminds me a lot of DJing because you have to do that as well. You have to be extremely quick on your feet. And so interpreting is I'm so much more comfortable with it. But with translating, where it's so much more detail oriented and you have a deadline, so you have time to, go over the script. And I don't know, it's just really, really hard for me. So because of that, I don't do it. I refuse a lot of work, for translation work, but I was given an opportunity to do a really big job, and it was quite interesting content. And, it was at the end of the year actually. So I thought, I don't really have that much going on anyway. So maybe this is a great way to once more, you know, um, put myself out there. And I knew it was going to be extremely overwhelming, and yet I did it. And I'm so glad I did, because I had such a wonderful feeling of accomplishment from, becoming vulnerable and doing it. And it just has been time after time. I'm having so many of those moments. And it's the same with interpreting too. This is how I got to where I am now, but I put myself out there, become vulnerable, don't know if I'm up for the task, but I do it anyway. And it always leads to being a learning curve for me. And I think that's just how I learn. And I know this about myself. So I do try to do that, Of course, I don't try to, you know, do a job where it's like, oh, okay, biochemistry translation. There's no way that I would, put myself out there for that, because I would completely not know what I'm doing. Reading and writing, as I mentioned, has always been such a weakness for me, but moving to the States in 2008, all of a sudden I was having to read and write emails with clients a lot more. And that was also a great opportunity for me to get more confidence in both of those. And so it's just been a really wonderful learning experience, but it's also been terrifying and it's been frustrating. And, what's kind of ironic about it now is when my dad was alive, he would always tell me, this was before I really started doing a lot of interpreting, but my dad would always say, Liesl, you have a gift for language, and I really hope that you use your Japanese, and I hope that you, keep studying, right? And did I listen to him? Absolutely not. Um, but it's kind of funny how now language has just become such a big part of who I am. And I find language to be an extremely powerful tool. When I show up for a job, the Japanese client is always, they are just blown away by the fact that I'm their interpreter, because of course I don't look like I would speak Japanese. And so they're like, yeah, uso, like, what? I can't believe that you're our interpreter. Um, but with that also comes a lot of freedom and liberty to use a much more simple style of Japanese. The Japanese workplace is all about keigo, usually with meetings and all that. And I can use keigo, and I do use keigo, but with the formal Japanese or keigo, you're always putting a distance between your client or your customer or whoever it is that you're communicating with. So when I am hired by a Japanese company, I will a lot of times try to put in a little bit more of the casual Japanese, because it helps establish a more informal relationship, and makes the communication go a lot smoother with the two parties. Now, this is not something that I do always, right? But sometimes, especially when the communication is broken down so far to where they need an interpreter, and that's why I'm there, then I will do things like that. And so the whole psychology behind interpreting and language, and how it's just so intertwined with the culture of the country, is something that is really fascinating to me. And I love being involved in that world. I have had some of the most incredible experiences through my interpreting, and I wouldn't change that for the world. So that is why we're talking about bilingualism. But I hope that you enjoyed this podcast today, and I look forward to having you guys join me next week as well. You can find my podcast once more at Spotify now, which I'm very excited about, and some other streaming platforms as well. Thank you so much for joining me for Adventures of a Blonde Geisha. My name is Lisa Wilkerson, and I hope that you have a wonderful, wonderful day wherever you may be listening from. Live for lots of love, lots of peace. And I will see you again on my next episode of Adventures of a Blonde Geisha. Janet, bye.